Number 10. The lead mask's case. Some mysteries begin with a scream, a struggle, or a visible act of violence. Others begin with something much quieter and far more disturbing. Two bodies, no obvious signs of attack, no clear explanation, and details so strange that the case seems to resist ordinary reality from the very first moment. That is what happened in Brazil in 1966, in a case now known as the lead mask's case. On a hill in Niterói, two men were found dead side by side. They were dressed in suits, they wore waterproof coats, and over their eyes were handmade lead masks, shaped like crude protective visors, as though they had prepared for some event involving light, radiation, or something they believed would descend from above. Near them was a notebook containing cryptic instructions, including a reference to a specific time and the chilling phrase that has echoed through the case ever since. After taking capsules, wait for the signal. It sounds less like a normal death investigation and more like the opening scene of an occult science fiction nightmare. The men were identified as electronics technicians, intelligent enough to build an experiment, ordinary enough that their deaths did not fit any easy myth of criminals or fanatics detached from reality. And yet the details around the case kept pushing the story into stranger territory. Witnesses reported unusual lights in the sky around the area. The men had apparently purchased raincoats in advance. They had travelled with purpose. They seemed to be following a plan, but no one could fully explain what the plan actually was. That uncertainty is what transformed the case from unusual to unforgettable. Were they involved in some kind of spiritualist ritual mixed with amateur scientific belief? Were they attempting contact with extraterrestrials, energies, or visions they expected to survive only by following exact instructions? Did the capsules kill them? And if so, what were they meant to do? A toxicological answer that might have clarified everything never arrived in a decisive way, in part because the decomposition of the bodies and limitations in the investigation left too much unresolved. The case became a chamber full of half-open doors, each leading somewhere bizarre, and the lead masks themselves remain the most unsettling symbol of all, because they imply expectation, preparation, intention. These men did not appear to wander into chaos by accident. They seemed to believe something was about to happen, something important enough to justify ritual-like steps and bizarre equipment. The masks do not just suggest danger, they suggest anticipation of a phenomenon the men thought they understood better than they actually did. That is why the lead mask's case only grew stranger with time. If it had been solved quickly as poisoning, fraud, or delusion, it might have become an obscure local tragedy. Instead, its unanswered elements allowed it to evolve into something darker, a collision of technology, mysticism, secrecy, and death. A modern historical mystery that feels oddly medieval in one moment and unnervingly futuristic in the next. Even now it sits in that uncomfortable territory between rational explanation and the sense that the dead carried a private logic into the hills with them and never brought it back. Number 9. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld. Some historical mysteries feel strange because the details are bizarre. Others feel dangerous because the consequences are enormous. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld belongs to that second category, where uncertainty is not just unsettling, but politically explosive. In September 1961, Hammarskjöld, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, was travelling to what was meant to be a peace mission during the Congo crisis, one of the most volatile conflicts of the post-colonial era. His plane went down near Ndola, in what is now Zambia. He died along with the others on board. Official explanations moved quickly toward accident, pilot error, technical failure, tragic circumstances in a night approach. But the case never settled cleanly into that version of events. Almost immediately, doubts began to gather. Witnesses reported seeing another aircraft. Some accounts suggested the possibility of an explosion, gunfire, or external interference. The political context only made suspicion harder to dismiss. Hammarskjöld was not an obscure traveller lost to chance. He was a major international figure moving through a crisis shaped by decolonization, Cold War rivalry, mineral interests, mercenary networks, covert operations, and governments with strong motives to influence the outcome of events in Central Africa. In that environment, a plane crash could never remain just a plane crash. It became a question with consequences far beyond aviation. Was Hammarskjöld killed because his diplomatic efforts threatened powerful interests? Was the aircraft sabotaged, attacked, or deliberately brought down? Or did the politics surrounding the crash simply make an ordinary disaster look sinister in hindsight? That tension has haunted the case for decades because no answer has ever fully erased the other possibilities. Each investigation, each document, each witness account has seemed to clarify one part of the story while making another part more troubling. And time has not calmed the mystery. It has intensified it. Because as the decades passed, more attention returned to overlooked testimony, intelligence claims, and the broader geopolitical landscape surrounding his death. The more historians and investigators examined the context, the harder it became to treat the event as a neatly closed matter. This was an era of covert interference, deniable violence, secret alliances, and private actors operating in the shadows of collapsing empires. The historical environment itself makes innocence feel fragile. That is what gives the mystery its enduring power. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld is not simply a question of what happened in the sky over Africa that night. It is a question of how much history can be bent behind closed doors while the public is handed a cleaner story. It raises the possibility that the official version of major events may survive not because it is fully convincing, but because it is the version institutions can bear to live with. And when that possibility enters a case, every missing detail becomes heavier. Hammarskjöld's death only grew stranger with time because the world around it gradually revealed how capable it was of secrecy. A suspicious crash in isolation is one thing. A suspicious crash embedded in Cold War realpolitik, corporate interest, anti-colonial struggle, and hidden networks of force is something else entirely. It becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a test of whether history is willing to admit how often power operates in darkness. And that is why the case still feels unsettled. Not because uncertainty is unusual, but because in this case, uncertainty itself feels like evidence that the full truth may have been too dangerous to speak plainly. Number 8. The Isdal woman. Some mysteries become famous because they are dramatic from the beginning. Others become famous because every detail seems to have been stripped of its proper explanation. The case of the Isdal woman belongs to that second category. It is not simply a death without a name. It is a death surrounded by so many signs of concealment that the absence of identity begins to feel almost intentional. In 1970, the burned body of an unidentified woman was discovered in Norway's Isdal Valley, a place whose isolation already gave the case an eerie atmosphere before investigators even began to unravel it. What they found only deepened the unease. The woman had no clear identity. Labels had been removed from her clothing. Her movements across Europe appeared to involve false names, hotels, wigs, and a trail of behavior that sounded less like an ordinary traveler and more like someone carefully curating what others were allowed to know about her. That is the detail that transformed the case from tragic to haunting. Because a missing identity can happen. Records fail. Families lose contact, strangers die far from home. But the Isdal woman seemed to have been living inside a controlled fog. Different aliases, different appearances, minimal traceable background. It was as though she existed in fragments, each one just convincing enough to function for a moment, but not enough to become a real person in the archival sense. The closer investigators came to her daily movements, the further they seemed to drift from her actual life. That pattern gave rise to one of the most enduring suspicions around the case: espionage. The timing helped that theory survive. This was Cold War Europe, a continent saturated with surveillance, intelligence work, border tensions, and invisible networks moving beneath ordinary civilian life. A woman traveling under multiple identities, speaking different languages, behaving cautiously, and dying under suspicious circumstances was almost destined to be interpreted through that lens. Perhaps she was a spy. Perhaps she was a courier. Perhaps she had entered a world of secrets that erased her more completely in death than in life. But the spy theory, like so much in this case, remains suspended between plausibility and projection. Because the Isdal woman could also have been something else entirely. A woman fleeing her past, a participant in smuggling or clandestine networks unrelated to state intelligence, a deeply private person whose life only appears theatrical because investigators encountered it at the worst possible ending. The problem is that every explanation seems to fit part of the case while leaving behind a residue of unease. Why the removed labels? Why the aliases? Why the elaborate trail of false presentation? Why did so much seem arranged to prevent recognition? And that is why the case only became stranger with time. An unidentified body can eventually become a solved story. This one became the opposite. Advances in forensic analysis, renewed public attention, and decades of fascination did not turn the mystery into something smaller. They made its emotional weight heavier. Because the Isdal woman is not just a puzzle about cause of death. It is a puzzle about personhood. A human being moved across borders, occupied rooms, spoke to people, made choices, and then vanished so thoroughly into uncertainty that history still cannot confidently tell us who she was. That is a particularly chilling form of mystery. A lost ship leaves wreckage. A political death leaves motives. But an unknown woman with a carefully obscured life leaves something even more unsettling. The possibility that a person can pass through the modern world leaving just enough evidence to be seen, but not enough to be known. And once that possibility settles in, the Isdal woman stops feeling like an isolated case. She begins to feel like a ghost produced by the 20th century itself. Number 7. The Tamam Shud case. If the Isdal woman feels like a mystery built out of hidden movement and fractured identity, the Tamam Shud case feels like a mystery staged with almost unbearable precision. A body on a beach. No clear cause that satisfies everyone, no confirmed identity at the time. And tucked into the story, one of the most famous fragments in the history of unsolved cases. 2 words torn from a book carrying the sense of a final message no one has been able to fully decode. In December 1948, an unidentified man was found dead on Somerton Beach near Adelaide, Australia. He was well dressed, he appeared outwardly ordinary, but nearly everything about the case soon turned strange. There were no obvious signs that explained why he had died there. His identity was unknown. Clues around him seemed to hint at deliberate concealment. And eventually, investigators discovered a tiny scrap of paper hidden in a fob pocket, bearing the words Tamam Shud, a Persian phrase often translated as ended or finished, taken from a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Few details could have been more perfectly engineered to haunt history. Because once those words entered the case, the death stopped feeling merely unexplained. It began to feel literary, coded, almost ritualistic. The scrap led investigators to a particular copy of the Rubaiyat, inside which they found markings, a phone number, and a sequence of letters that many interpreted as some kind of code. That discovery launched decades of speculation. Was the dead man a spy? Was this a covert message linked to Cold War intelligence? Was it suicide arranged with symbolic intent? Was it poisoning so subtle that the evidence never settled cleanly? Or was the case only accidentally theatrical, its strangeness amplified by the human tendency to turn ambiguity into design? The spy theory became one of the most persistent for obvious reasons. The timing was perfect for it. The early Cold War was an age of suspicion, defections, intelligence games, and ordinary-looking men with hidden affiliations. An unidentified corpse, with possible coded writing in a pocket, and no straightforward explanation almost invited that interpretation. But the same atmosphere that made espionage plausible also made it dangerously attractive as a theory. The case sits in that difficult space where historical context can illuminate a mystery while also exaggerating it. And yet the mystery endures because even stripped of its Cold War glamour, the details remain genuinely unnerving. The words Tamam Shud carry a finality that feels almost too perfect. The hidden scrap suggests secrecy. The unidentified man gives the story an immediate emotional void. The possible code promises revelation and then withholds it. Each element seems to point beyond itself, as if the case is perpetually on the edge of disclosure without ever crossing into clarity. That is the pattern that makes some mysteries immortal. They do not merely remain unsolved, they remain suggestive. And over time, that suggestiveness becomes its own force. Every generation returns to the Somerton man and sees a slightly different shadow. For some, it is a spy thriller buried inside a beach death. For others, it is a forensic puzzle about identity, toxicology, and missed opportunities. For others still, it is a near-perfect example of how random fragments can create the illusion of grand design. But none of those lenses have managed to fully silence the deeper discomfort. The case still feels like it belongs to a hidden world of messages, covers, and endings that only one man truly understood. That is why the Tamam Shud case only got stranger with time. Because the more we learned, the less it felt like a simple, unidentified death, and the more it resembled an unfinished narrative whose final pages had been removed. It is not just the mystery of who the man was or how he died. It is the unsettling impression that the case was once coherent to someone somewhere, and that coherence has been almost perfectly erased. All that remains is the body, the scrap of paper, and the unbearable sense of a story ending without letting history read the middle. Number 6. The Sodder children disappearance. Some historical mysteries survive because evidence is thin. Others survive because too much refuses to fit together. The disappearance of the Sodder children belongs to that second category. It is not only a story of loss, it is a story of contradiction, of aftermath that never settled into grief because the central question was never allowed to die. On Christmas Eve in 1945, a fire consumed the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jenny Sodder escaped along with several of their children. But 5 of the Sodder children were believed to have been trapped inside. In the immediate logic of tragedy, the story should have ended there. A devastating house fire, a family shattered, a mourning sealed by catastrophe. But almost immediately the case began to resist that explanation. No convincing remains of the missing children were found in the ashes. That absence became the wound that never closed. Fires destroy, but they also usually leave something behind. Bones, fragments, physical confirmation that lets horror become certainty. In the Sodder case, that certainty never came in a way the family could accept. And once that void appeared, every strange detail around the fire began to grow in importance. There were reports of unusual events before the blaze. A cut telephone line, a ladder that was mysteriously out of place when it was desperately needed. Problems with the family's trucks when George tried to use them. Accounts from witnesses who later claimed to have seen the missing children after the fire. And above all, the family's conviction that the children had not died in the house at all, but had been taken. That belief transformed the story from a tragedy into a living historical mystery. Was the fire a cover for abduction? Was there some personal, criminal, or retaliatory motive hidden beneath the official account? Or was the family, shattered by the unbearable lack of remains, drawn into a pattern familiar in unsolved cases? The refusal of the mind to accept death without proof. That possibility has to be taken seriously because grief can shape interpretation with enormous force. But so can the absence of evidence. And in this case, absence did not calm suspicion. It fed it. The Sodders did not let the case fade into memory. They kept searching. They publicized the mystery. They followed leads. They held on to the possibility that the missing children had survived and were somewhere out in the world, separated from them by violence, conspiracy, or silence. Over time, one claimed sighting after another surfaced. Some were vague, some sounded tantalizing, none settled the question. That is what gives the case its peculiar emotional intensity. It never became fully forensic because it remained deeply human. A family refused to stop looking, and by refusing they kept the mystery alive far beyond the night of the fire itself. And time only made it stranger. Because the longer the children remained unconfirmed in death, the more the case seemed to hover between two realities. In one version, the children died in the flames, and the mystery is built on pain, confusion, and investigative failure. In the other, the fire was only the visible part of a much darker event, one that hid a disappearance inside a disaster. Neither explanation has ever been able to fully erase the other. That tension is why the story still grips people decades later. The Sodder children disappearance is not just about what happened that night. It is about what happens when a family is denied the one thing history depends on most: closure. Without it, every inconsistency becomes evidence, every witness becomes possible salvation, and every passing year makes the unanswered question heavier. The case does not merely ask whether the children died or were taken. It asks how long uncertainty can survive when grief refuses to surrender to the official story. In this mystery, the fire ended quickly. The doubt never did. Number 5. The Mary Celeste. There are few images in historical mystery more enduring than a ship found adrift with no sign of those who should have been aboard. It is the kind of scenario that feels almost designed to outlive explanation. The Mary Celeste became one of the most famous examples, not because it vanished, but because it remained. The ship was there, the people were not, and that difference is what made the story immortal. In 1872, the brigantine Mary Celeste was discovered in the Atlantic Ocean by another vessel, drifting but still afloat. It was not a wreck in the conventional sense. The ship was seaworthy, though clearly abandoned. Cargo remained on board. Personal belongings were still present. There were no obvious signs of catastrophic violence that could neatly explain why everyone had left. The crew, passengers, and lifeboat were gone. That arrangement is what made the case so powerful from the beginning. A lost ship can be explained by storm, collision, war, or sinking. But an intact ship stripped of its human presence feels different. It feels staged by the sea itself. Every remaining object becomes eerie. Every ordinary detail turns accusatory. Why was the vessel left behind? What event could have persuaded experienced people to abandon a ship that still seemed capable of carrying them forward? And if they did leave in panic, why was there so little direct evidence of the thing they feared? That absence invited myth almost immediately. Piracy, mutiny, alcohol fumes, waterspouts, seaquakes, giant waves, insurance fraud, supernatural intervention. Practically every theory that can attach itself to an abandoned vessel has been attached to the Mary Celeste. Some explanations are more plausible than others. A problem involving the cargo, perhaps creating fear of explosion, has long been considered one reasonable possibility. A navigational or weather-related misjudgment may have led the occupants to temporarily leave the ship in the lifeboat, only to be lost while the main vessel drifted onward without them. That explanation has the virtue of simplicity, but simplicity has never fully satisfied anyone, because the emotional force of the mystery lies in how close the ship remained to normality. If the Mary Celeste had been shattered, bloodstained, or burned, it would have belonged to one category of horror. Instead, it drifted in a more unsettling register. It looked survivable, habitable, recoverable. That is what gives the story its haunted quality. The vessel itself seems to argue that the people should still have been there, and so the case kept growing in the imagination. Writers exaggerated it. Popular retellings blurred fact and fiction. Details were embellished until the Mary Celeste became less a specific maritime incident and more a symbol of unexplained abandonment. That process made the mystery simultaneously larger and more difficult to pin down. The real case was strange enough. The legend made it stranger still. Over time, the ship stopped being just a 19th century puzzle and became a floating archetype of disappearance. That is why the Mary Celeste only got stranger with time. The more history preserved it, the more myth attached itself to it. And yet beneath the embellishment, the core remains unsettlingly strong. A vessel crossing the ocean. A normal voyage. Then, suddenly, an intact ship without its people. It is one of those rare cases where the setting does much of the work. The open sea already feels indifferent, enormous, and capable of erasing events without witness. Place a nearly untouched ship inside that emptiness, and mystery becomes almost inevitable. The Mary Celeste survives because it presents a scene history hates most, an outcome without a visible event. Something happened. The ship proves that much. But whatever happened was swallowed so cleanly that what remains is not an answer, but a tableau. A ship moving through water as though nothing is wrong, carrying the shape of human absence across the ocean like a message no one ever learned how to read. Number 4. The Lost Franklin Expedition. Some mysteries are terrifying because they end in violence. Others are terrifying because they dissolve into silence so completely that even the landscape seems to become part of the concealment. The Lost Franklin Expedition belongs to that second kind of horror. It is not only a story of death in the Arctic, it is a story of confidence swallowed by ice, empire reduced to rumor, and a search for answers that only made the tragedy feel larger. In 1845, Sir John Franklin sailed from Britain with 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and 129 men. The mission was celebrated as one more bold step in the imperial pursuit of the Northwest Passage, that elusive Arctic route that had haunted navigators for generations. On paper, it was a grand undertaking shaped by discipline, naval technology, and national prestige. The ships were well equipped, the officers were experienced. The expedition seemed to embody the age's belief that determination and planning could force even the most hostile environment to yield. Then the Arctic answered with indifference. The expedition vanished. At first, disappearance could still be interpreted as delay. Ice, weather, distance, and poor communication made uncertainty normal in polar exploration. But as time passed and no return came, Franklin's voyage transformed from heroic mission into one of the great historical absences. Search expeditions were launched, clues emerged in fragments, graves, notes, relics, Inuit testimony. Each discovery brought the world closer to the fate of the expedition while somehow making the overall picture more disturbing. Because what emerged was not one clean ending. It was collapse stretched across a frozen wasteland. The ships became trapped in ice. Franklin died early. The surviving men eventually abandoned the vessels and attempted to escape southward across one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. What followed has haunted the case ever since. Starvation, exhaustion, sickness, desperation, and evidence suggesting that under the most extreme conditions, the final boundaries of civilized order may have broken. The Franklin expedition stopped being merely a lost voyage and became something darker, a confrontation between imperial confidence and absolute environmental power. And yet, even with all that, the mystery only deepened. Because Franklin's story survived not as a complete record, but as a damaged reconstruction built from scattered remains and incomplete testimony. We know enough to feel horror, but not enough to inhabit the final days with certainty. What decisions were made? What hopes survived longest? How long did discipline hold? What private fears spread through the ranks as rescue failed to arrive? Even with modern archaeology and the eventual discoveries of Erebus and Terror, the expedition still feels only partially returned to history. That partial return is what makes it so powerful. The Franklin expedition became stranger with time because every answer arrived wrapped in new unease. The discovery of remains did not settle the emotional weight of the story. It intensified it. The finding of the ships did not erase the mystery, it gave it form. Instead of a total disappearance, we were left with something arguably worse, the outline of a catastrophe whose human interior remains only dimly visible. Enough is known to disturb us. Enough remains unknown to keep the case alive, and perhaps that is why the Franklin story continues to hold such power. It is not just about explorers who died in the Arctic. It is about the breakdown of an entire worldview. A powerful empire sent its men, its vessels, and its confidence into a region it believed could be mastered. The result was not triumph, but a long unravelling preserved in ice and rumour. The Arctic did not merely defeat the expedition, it transformed it into a myth of endurance, suffering, and slow erasure. The lost Franklin expedition only got stranger with time because it kept changing shape. First, it was a patriotic mission, then a disappearance, then a national obsession, then a forensic tragedy, then a frozen archive slowly giving up its dead. And through each transformation, the same unsettling truth remained. The farther history followed Franklin into the ice, the darker the silence became. Number 3. The Man in the Iron Mask. Some historical mysteries are built around a death, a wreck, or a disappearance. This one is built around a face the world was not allowed to see. The Man in the Iron Mask has survived for centuries because it compresses so many disturbing ideas into a single image. Imprisonment without identity, secrecy enforced by power, and the possibility that one hidden prisoner mattered enough to be erased as a person while being preserved as a problem. Whether the mask was truly iron, velvet reinforced with metal, or transformed by legend over time almost becomes secondary. The symbol is what matters. A man was hidden so carefully that history never stopped wondering who he had to be. The prisoner associated with this mystery was held in 17th century France during the reign of Louis XIV. He was moved between prisons under the watch of officials who treated him with unusual caution. His identity was concealed, his existence was controlled. And when later writers and thinkers began to circle the case, it was not hard to see why imagination seized on it so fiercely. Ordinary prisoners are forgotten. This one was curated into obscurity. That detail changed everything, because a secret prisoner implies a secret worth protecting, and once that idea takes root, the mind immediately races toward the possibilities. Was he a disgraced noble, a political threat, a servant who knew too much, a twin brother of the king, hidden to protect dynastic stability, a scandal whose exposure would have damaged the monarchy at its core? Theories multiplied precisely because the available facts seemed strong enough to suggest importance, but too incomplete to confine it. That is the mechanism by which some mysteries become immortal. The Man in the Iron Mask sits at the point where history and theatrical secrecy overlap. There was a real prisoner. There was real concealment. There was enough administrative care to make the case feel deliberate rather than accidental. But there was also enough uncertainty for later generations to turn the prisoner into something almost mythic. The more monarchy relied on image, ritual, and controlled appearances, the more haunting it became to imagine a man hidden away because his very face was politically dangerous. And time only sharpened that haunting quality. Because the mystery does not simply ask who he was, it asks what kind of system creates a life like that. A regime powerful enough to bury a human being beneath layers of silence, to deny him a public self, and to let rumour do the rest. In that sense, the case is not merely about an individual prisoner. It is about the architecture of power. Courts, prisons, officials, sealed records, obedient silence. The hidden man becomes the dark mirror of royal spectacle. While one face is displayed to embody the state, another is concealed to protect it. That is why this mystery grew stranger rather than weaker over time. If the prisoner had been clearly identified beyond dispute, the story might have shrunk into a historical footnote. Instead, uncertainty made him larger. Literature amplified him. Political imagination reshaped him. The mask became more than an object. It became a metaphor for forbidden identity, for truths governments cannot safely admit, for the terrifying possibility that the official surface of history is maintained by lives pushed out of sight. In that way, the mystery escaped its century and became timeless. And yet what makes it endure is not just romance or conspiracy. It is the emotional violence of the image itself. To be imprisoned is one thing, to be imprisoned as a secret is another. The man in the iron mask survives because he represents a uniquely chilling form of erasure, not being killed, not disappearing, but being kept alive inside a system that refused to let the world know who you were. There are few historical mysteries more elegant than that, and few more disturbing, because whatever the full truth may have been, the core remains intact. Someone was hidden, someone's identity mattered enough to be buried, and the silence around that person was so carefully maintained that centuries later, history still has not decided whether it is confronting a political prisoner, a dynastic threat, or the perfect example of how power turns secrecy into legend. Number 2. The Roanoke colony. Some historical mysteries are powerful because they leave behind wreckage. Others are powerful because they leave behind almost nothing at all. That is what makes the fate of the Roanoke colony so haunting. In the late 16th century, England attempted to establish a permanent foothold in the New World on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. It was an ambitious project, but also a fragile one from the very beginning. Distance, limited supplies, difficult relations with local groups, political delays, and the sheer instability of colonial life made survival uncertain long before the mystery fully took shape. Still, settlers remained. Families were left behind. A community existed there long enough for hope to become real. And then that community slipped into silence. When Governor John White finally returned in 1590 after a long and involuntary delay in England, he did not find a colony under visible attack or the aftermath of a known massacre. He found abandonment. The settlement was deserted, buildings had been taken down. The people were gone. There were no bodies laid out to provide a final answer, no clear sign of battle, no neat conclusion waiting for him. Instead, there was only one of the most famous clues in early colonial history, the word Croatoan carved into a post, and the partial carving Suro elsewhere at the site. Few mysteries have ever rested on a fragment so small and yet so enduring, because that word suggested intention. It implied that the colonists had not simply vanished without thought. They had left a sign, but a sign that solved nothing on its own. Did it mean they had moved to Croatoan Island? Had they joined or been absorbed by a local indigenous community? Was it a destination, a warning, a last trace of order left behind by people trying to survive? The clue was enough to prevent the colony from becoming a pure disappearance, but not enough to rescue it from uncertainty. In a way, it made the mystery worse. An unexplained vanishing is terrifying. An unexplained vanishing with a message feels deliberate. That is why Roanoke never stayed just an early colonial puzzle. It became a screen onto which entire generations projected their anxieties. Some imagined massacre. Others imagined assimilation, survival, and cultural merging. Some framed the colony as a victim of the New World's dangers. Others saw it as an example of how fragile and dependent colonial ventures truly were, how quickly the self-image of an empire could collapse when stripped of supply lines and certainty. The mystery grew because it touched something larger than one settlement. Roanoke became a story about what happens when an imperial dream enters unfamiliar ground and disappears before it can explain itself. And time only made that story stranger. Because the farther the case moved from its original moment, the more it became layered with legend. Archaeological evidence, scattered accounts, local traditions, and historical reinterpretations have all suggested possible paths, but none have closed the case beyond dispute. The most plausible explanations are often the least dramatic: relocation, integration, hardship, adaptation. Yet even those possibilities do not dissolve the unease, they merely shift it. If the colonists survived by abandoning the shape of the colony itself, then Roanoke did not end in one catastrophic moment. It ended by dissolving into another world. That possibility is almost more haunting than a massacre, because it means the lost colony may not have been lost in the way history first imagined. It may have been transformed beyond recognition, absorbed into a reality English records were too narrow, too arrogant, or too incomplete to preserve. And if that is true, then the real mystery of Roanoke is not only where the colonists went, it is how history decides what counts as survival and what gets recorded as disappearance. The Roanoke colony only grew stranger with time because it never offered the comfort of finality. It left behind a settlement without settlers, a word without context, and a silence wide enough for 4 centuries of doubt. In that silence, Roanoke became more than a colonial mystery. It became one of the earliest great warnings that history can lose entire communities not only through death, but through broken narratives. Sometimes a people do not vanish all at once. Sometimes they vanish from the version of the story that survives. Number 1. The Princes in the Tower. Some mysteries become famous because they are dramatic. Others become immortal because they sit too close to power. The disappearance of the Princes in the Tower is one of the darkest examples in all of history because it combines everything that makes political mystery so enduring: innocence, ambition, silence, and a void exactly where the truth should be. In 1483, after the death of King Edward IV of England, his young sons, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, were placed in the Tower of London. At first, this could be presented as procedure, a temporary arrangement before a coronation. The Tower was still used as a royal residence in certain contexts. But history remembers what came next, not as preparation for rule, but as the beginning of one of the most unsettling disappearances in European history. The boys were seen, then they were seen less, then eventually they were not seen at all. That fading from view is what gives the case its terrible power. Because the princes were not obscure figures who slipped out of record by accident. They were children at the center of a dynastic crisis. Their very existence carried political weight. If they lived, they were a threat to those who wished to control the crown. If they died, their deaths would be among the most consequential acts of political violence in English history. That alone would have guaranteed suspicion. But what transformed the case into legend was the silence that followed. No public reckoning, no definitive confession, no universally accepted proof. Just absence and the immediate growth of suspicion around the man who benefited most from it, Richard III. That suspicion has shaped the case for centuries. Did Richard order the deaths of his nephews to secure the throne? It is the explanation that has seemed most brutally logical to many, and logic can be as dangerous as evidence when a mystery survives long enough. Others have suggested alternative culprits, rival factions, later claimants, or the general chaos of late medieval power struggles. Some have argued that certainty is impossible, that the story has been distorted by Tudor propaganda, by political storytelling, and by the victor's need to blacken Richard's name. Those arguments matter. History is often written by those who inherit power, and inherited narratives can harden into moral theatre. But even after all revision, the central horror remains untouched. 2 boys disappeared inside one of the most politically charged spaces in England, at the precise moment when their continued existence was inconvenient to the machinery of power. That is why the case survives every reinterpretation. Even if later writers sharpened its edges, the underlying shape is already chilling enough. It is a mystery about children transformed into liabilities by succession. A mystery in which the state itself seems to close around them. A mystery where silence feels less like ignorance and more like policy. And that is why it only got stranger with time. Because every century added new layers without resolving the old ones. Chroniclers, Dramatists, propagandists, historians, revisionists, novelists, all returned to the princes, and each return made the case feel less like one medieval crime and more like a permanent wound inside English historical memory. Even the discovery of bones in the tower, long associated by many with the Lost Boys, did not settle the matter in any universally satisfying way. Instead, it deepened the debate. The mystery remained exactly where it had always been, suspended between probability and proof, between political necessity and historical restraint. That suspension is what makes the princes the perfect number one. Because this is not merely a case of disappearance, it is a case of disappearance at the summit of legitimacy itself. Who rules? Who has the right to survive? What happens when children stand between ambition and a crown? The princes in the tower forced those questions into their starkest form. There is no exotic setting here, no coded manuscript, no ghost ship drifting across the sea. There is only power, bloodline, and the unbearable possibility that the simplest explanation is also the darkest. The case endures because it reveals something history rarely says aloud. Power does not always need spectacle. Sometimes it only needs silence. And few silences in history have echoed longer, darker, or more accusingly than the one that closed over the princes in the tower. Kitchen.